Well, welcome to Christian Answers. This is Pastor Jeff Short, your Bible teacher and cultural analyst. And today we're going to be talking about something happening in Minnesota and which has the potential of spreading to other cities and which has the potential of actually creating and causing some kind of a civil war in the United States. And this game that's being played in Minnesota, where protesters, so-called protesters who are protesting the activity of the immigration and customs enforcement officers to round up dangerous, illegal aliens who are in the country illegally. The protesters, I guess, are supporting the illegal, dangerous aliens who are not supposed to be here, who are here illegally. They're supporting those people, those bad guys, and they're going around trying to thwart in every way possible the capture of illegal aliens in this country who are scheduled to be deported back to the country of their origins. And yet you have these misguided, foolish citizens who are going around trying to impede and oppose lawful authority from the federal government to remove these illegal aliens from our country. And that doesn't mean that they're killing them. They're not shooting these people on sight. They are not beating these people to a pulp. They're simply detaining them and removing them and deporting them, which is totally in line with every other administration that we've ever had in this country. Has a power to enforce border policies and immigration policies, and that's what these officers of ICE, as it's nicknamed, are doing. And these misguided citizens who think they're some kind of great civil rights agitator, activists, are so foolish in their activities. Now, they have the right to protest under our laws, our federal laws, our amendments in the Constitution, and so on and so forth. They have the right to protest and voice their opposition to a immigration policy or a deportation policy. They have definitely the right to voice their opposition and also vote accordingly and vote against these policies. But they do not have the right, as citizens of the United States, they do not have the right to wrestle with, push, impede, drive their cars and block the vehicles of these immigration officers. They do not have the right to oppose these officers in their daily routine of rounding up these bad guys and deporting them back to their country. They don't have the right to stop the operations from taking place just because they don't agree with the policy. They can protest the policy, they can march in the streets against the policy, they can shout and scream and do all kinds of other things, but the moment they start wrestling with, shoving, pushing, throwing objects at these officers, they have crossed the line. And so no Christian, no Bible-believing, godly person should be participating in these violent protests that are taking place right now in Minnesota. Now, there are godly Christians who can biblically and spiritually and in a Christian way oppose a policy of the U.S. government, of course, and voice their concern and vote against that if there are Christians in Minnesota who believe that these ICE officers should not be rounding up illegal aliens, even though they're drug dealers or domestic abusers or criminals, even though they can be wrong and these citizens can be misguided, and you can even be a Christian and be foolishly misguided, is misled by the news media and by liberal radical activists. You can be confused and voice your concern and protest and vote foolishly for these radical leftist policies like the sanctuary cities, for example. The whole idea of a sanctuary city is actually illegal. It's contrary to our federal laws. So you have pockets of rebellion against the federal government in this country. You have cities who say to the federal government, no, we're not going to allow the federal laws to apply in our cities. That is illegal, but that's being tolerated right now. That has to come to an end. We need to eliminate all of these so-called sanctuary cities because they are pockets and fomenting rebellion and revolution, which is contrary to Christian teaching. We are called as Christians to obey those in authority unless they cause us to sin. So the Bible is very clear about this. So as a Christian, you can oppose the policy. You can voice your opposition to the policy. You can go to a rally and gathering that opposes the policies if you don't like. I don't know why you would, because every nation needs to be able to set border policies, and every nation needs to be able to say who can be there and who can not be there based on the criminal record of the individual or all kinds of other political factors. They can determine who is to be allowed in the country and who is not to be allowed in the country. Every country needs that right. Why would you oppose that right? So there's a lot of confusion and misguided people out in the streets right now. And of course, there are the professional agitators and activists who are hired. This is their full-time job, connected to organizations like the Open Society, George Soros, all these billionaires who are funding the actual undermining of the law and order in our country in order to push their own political vision. And then there are those mayors and governors, like in Minnesota, you have Governor Tim Walz and Jacob Frey, the mayor of Minnesota, Minneapolis, St. Paul. And they are aiding and abetting these illegal agitators and activists these activists are impeding the work of federal authorities, which is not legal. But it's a cat and mouse game up there in Minnesota because these protesters, they're doing something that is legal, which is protesting, which is voicing their concerns about policies. Okay, so far so good. But when they go so far as to hinder, oppose, resist, scuffle with, wrestle with, try to fight these law enforcement officers, that is where it crosses the line. And so as Christians, we cannot be involved in this kind of violent, physical kind of open resistance against the authorities because the Bible teaches against it. And it's going to lead to chaos. And it already has produced chaos and mayhem, and it may even start a civil war, like I said before. And in many respects, there already is a civil war because you have the governor of this state of Minnesota basically challenges the federal government and threatening to deploy National Guard, Minnesota National Guard, against the federal law enforcement and Border Patrol and Homeland Security, and defying the federal government in an area which is totally foolish to do so. You can debate these policies. You can argue one side or the other, and that should be done in Congress at the Washington, D.C. level. But if there is a federal law that says that the Customs and Immigration officers have a right to detain people who are in this country illegally, especially those with a violent background or some kind of criminal background, if there's a law that allows them to do that, you cannot, as a governor like Tim Walz is, or a mayor like Jacob Frey for Minneapolis, St. Paul, you cannot defy that law. You cannot encourage citizens to oppose that and violently scuffle with police and throw objects at police and burn their patrol cars and steal their rifles and weapons and ransack their equipment. You cannot do that. That is open defiance and rebellion, and that cannot stand. And no Christian should be a part of that open defiance and rebellion. Christians, again, can protest, voice their opinions, vote for certain policies, but when you confront a legal authority and begin to take violent action against them by actually trying to wrestle or scuffle with them or punch them or defy their commands, legitimate commands, you are in violation of God's law. And let me read to you Romans 13 that says this very, very clear. It says in Romans 13, the New Testament, verse 1, everyone must submit himself to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Okay, so you have a basic government structure. And in this country, we have it so good because we can argue and debate, and we can put forth arguments, and we can muster points and reasons against opponents' points and reasons, and we can fight it out and debate. And in Congress, this should be done. And when politicians run for office, this should be done. And so there's a civil discourse about what the policy should be. But as Christians, we are commanded to obey the basic authorities. So in other words, you cannot come up to a law enforcement officer who tells you to move, and you cannot simply defy his order, or even worse, that we see here, these so-called protesters, who are really professional agitators in many cases, they're actually coming at these law enforcement officers and pushing and shoving them and throwing hard objects, rocks and chunks of ice and chunks of concrete, and actually pointing rockets at them and firing off firecrackers and rockets right at them and burning down the officers' vehicles and stealing weapons out of their gun cache. These are acts of chaos, mob rule. And if you're a part of a mob and you're defying legitimate authority, you are in violation of Romans 13:1. You are not given authority by God to do that. It says that consequently, he who rebels against the authority is rebelling against the God who has instituted it, and those who do so will bring judgment upon themselves. So, most recently, you had a number of incidents in Minnesota fueled by the liberal radical left media and also the radical left liberal politicians like Jacob Fry, the mayor of Minneapolis-St. Paul, and Tim Walz, governor of the whole state of Minnesota. They're fueling these agitators and activists. And so you had this woman, Renee Good, block the road for law enforcement. She drove her SUV in the middle of the road in order to impede, oppose, block the immigration and custom enforcement officers. So she was defying the public, legitimate authority of these officers. And she would not move. She was given a command to move her car, and she did not do so in defiance of these officers who had the authority to tell her to move it. Now, if you're going to allow her to block a federal agent, then you can allow anyone to do anything. And we see this today often in these police body cam videos where you have more and more citizens who are pulled over for some speeding violation or some auto infraction. The policeman says, roll down the window. They defy the policeman. The policeman keeps telling them, you need to show me your license. No, I'm not going to. I'm not doing this. I'm not doing it. More and more of this rebellion is taking place, and it's becomes because of these defiances they see on TV by Tim Walz and Jacob Fry, the mayor of Minneapolis, St. Paul, and the radical left, these Democratic politicians who foment actual revolution and rebellion and chaos. They encourage it by their rhetoric and by their encouraging citizens to oppose legitimate authority. And so what happens is you have this Renee Good who actively opposing and defying legitimate authority, and then she starts to try to speed ahead with her vehicle and strikes a law enforcement officer and gets shot and killed in the process. And now the media is trying to spin this as a murder by the policeman. No. This was the consequences of her trying to physically attack through the use of a motor vehicle an officer, a legitimate enforcement officer of the law. This is rebellion, and this is sinful, and this is wrong, and no Christian can be a part of it. Then now you have other people who are doing other acts of defiance, physical altercations with law enforcement. The latest is this man who law enforcement is trying to deal with a woman who is trying to block the street and oppose and impede their operation, trying to apprehend these bad people who are in the country illegally. And this woman is trying to tangle up the officers and impede them and oppose them. And one of the officers shoves her down, which he deserved to shove her down, and she deserved to go down. So this other man rushes in and tries to defend the woman by wrestling with and tossing with and physically engaging a law enforcement officer with a gun. Now, under circumstances where this is not a law enforcement officer and this is not a legal operation, and you see a man push a woman down, yeah, I could understand why you would then defend the woman and then get into a physical altercation with that person. But this is a law enforcement officer, and he was legitimately telling this woman to leave the area, and she wouldn't, and so she got pushed down, and this so-called protester, agitator, activist had no right to then start physically fighting this law enforcement officer. And as it turns out, this man who intervened had a gun on his person. And so law enforcement is trying to take this gun away from him. He's resisting their trying to remove the gun from him, and he gets shot in the process. Okay? So we're going to see this played out over and over and over and over again. It's a game that these agitators and the radical left are playing. They're saying, we're going to continue to defy and fight and resist and physically fight with and push and shove and do all. We're going to create mayhem and chaos in these scenes, and then we're going to blame it all on the law enforcement officers. And we're going to take them to court, and we're going to ruin their life, and we're going to just cause so much chaos and mayhem and confusion that people are finally going to say, okay, everybody, stop deporting illegal aliens, stop arresting people with criminal backgrounds that shouldn't be here anyway. Just stop doing all of that because it's causing too much internal strife, and then they get their way. And this is wrong. This is wrong. It says in Romans 13, it says, for the rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Do you want to be free from the fear of the one in authority? Then do what is right, and he will commend you. If you want to protest, if you're a Christian and you want to protest, I'm not even talking about whether the policy is good or bad right now. I'm not even talking about whether the border policy is good or bad or immigration policies are good or bad. I have opinions on that, and I've given those opinions. I'm simply talking about if you're a Christian who opposes ICE arresting illegal aliens and deporting them back to their country, if you oppose that, then you do so in a nonviolent way. You do so by not violating Romans 13, by causing chaos and sowing seeds of mayhem and rioting and rebellion and violent altercations with these law enforcement officers. You are the problem at that point if you're doing that, and you should stop it. It's sinful. It's anti-Christian. It says here, do you want to be free from the fear of the one in authority? Then do what is right, and he will commend you, for he is God's servant to do you good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword for nothing. He is God's servant, an agent of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. So if you think, as a protester, that you can cross the line from voicing your opinion and protesting and holding up a sign, if you think you can cross the line and begin to push and shove an agent of the federal law enforcement community, and you think you have the right to throw objects at them, to burn their police cars down, and to steal their weapons and materials from that car, if you think you have the right to block the street with your vehicle, if you think you have the right to run into someone from the law enforcement community to get your will, to push your policies and promote your border policies, you are wrong. You have crossed the line from protesting and voicing your opinion. You have crossed the line into rebellion. And if you get shot, that's on you. It's just the same way as if you're driving a car and a policeman pulls you over and he's going to give you a ticket for speeding, or he's going to give you a ticket for failing to stop at a stoplight, or for running through a red light, or whatever the situation is. If you think that you have the right to openly defy his legitimate authority to tell you, to show you registration and insurance, and to step out of the car if need be. We've all been detained by the police in some kind of a traffic stop, and we don't like it. And we're not in a good mood. We don't want to talk to the policeman. We'd rather him go away, but we don't have the right to defy his legitimate orders and commands. We have to comply. And so every parent should tell their teenage sons and teenage daughters and their young people, if the police give you an order, comply with the order. And now it looks like we need to tell adults this. If the legitimate authorities, law enforcement, whether it's immigration enforcement or whether it's customs enforcement or local police or some kind of National Guard or whatever, if they give you a command and authority, authoritative instructions, you have to comply. You have to comply. And you cannot sit there and argue with them. You cannot push them. You cannot run away, try to drive your car away in defiance. You cannot treat legitimate authority, according to the Bible, you cannot treat legitimate authority established by the government to prevent chaos. You cannot defy them. And these adults, a lot of times it's women, unfortunately middle-aged women, but also there are men in the picture, but it probably majority women, who think they can come up to a law enforcement officer and shove and push and scream in their face and impede their operation that they're undergoing, and think they can harass these officers and get away with it and not have any consequences happen against them. This woman that was blocking the road with her SUV and defying legitimate orders, this woman who was shot, That was unfortunate that she got shot. But if you're doing that kind of activity and defying that kind of authority, you're standing up to people with guns in their hands. You better be ready to basically die, because they don't have to wait to talk this over with you. They have an operation they're carrying out, and if you get in the way, they may run over you. And they may shoot you if they feel threatened. So if you're a stupid fool, like this latest shooter, he's going to defy these guys with rifles and pistols in their hands and try to fight them physically. He's going to try to push and shove and scuffle with these people who are carrying guns. And he's got a gun on him, and once they find out he's got a gun, they're going to try to remove that gun, and if he resists them moving that gun, he's probably going to get shot, which he did. It's a game. It's set up to mathematically certain get people killed, get people injured. If these agitators, these activists continue to defy the law and treat with contempt and disrespect legitimate officers of the federal government, and think that they can get away with that unscathed, they're mistaken, because they're going to wind up dead or injured or hurt in some way, because these officers, they're not playing around. This is a game for these protesters a lot of times. They think that for so long they've been able to get away with everything. They could burn down blocks of cities, like after George Floyd and the riots that followed. They think they can get away with anything. Burning down a police precinct, they basically got away with that. Burning down millions and billions of dollars of business, property, they think they can get away with that. Mayhem, chaos, riots, no consequences. They think, oh, we can do this. We can push officers. We can shove officers. We can throw ice at them, concrete bricks at them. We can aim firecrackers at them, rockets at them. We can burn down their squad cars. We can steal their weapons and materials from their operations. We can do anything we want. They think they can do that. Well, guess what? They can't. And if they're going to do that and try to play that deadly game, they're going to get shot, and they're probably going to get killed. And it's on them. So, yeah, the Bible tells us that this kind of activity is totally unchristian. Protesting, yes. Voicing your opposition to policies, yes. Violently opposing legitimate authority in society, no. That leads to chaos. That leads to mayhem. And the Lord God is totally against that. Romans 13 in the New Testament teaches us that is not what we are allowed to do. Well, I hope that's been a helpful analysis, and we will see you back next week on another program. God bless.